$100,000? $1,000,000? Even more? I could keep on tossing around numbers for the rest of my speech. But the thing is, we won't know. We're not going to know. We will never know the price of a human life. But what I can tell you is that even without that life, a human body is worth about $10,000. That brings me to my topic of human cadavers. With the research that I have done and the lab experience that I have had with cadavers, I hope to enlighten you, to give you an appreciation for the human body and how intricate and how interesting it works. I'm going to teach you about the early history of cadavers, the ancient uses, the modern uses in medicine, and the uses in other subjects that you may not know about. And that brings me to my first point, where I'm going to explore the ancient uses of cadavers. Now, first off, I'm going to start with the Greeks. Now, a lot of you may be thinking about ancient mummies, like Egyptians, but I'm starting off with Greeks because they have the most influence in our modern knowledge of anatomy and the uses of cadavers. Now, first started off in roughly the 2nd century BC with the Greek philosophers Aristotle and Hippocrates. They began their system of anatomy based upon animal dissection. They would dissect animals such as goats or sheep and observe their anatomy. And this isn't exactly the most crazy thing to do, because animals, they share a very similar anatomy as compared to us humans. Like, goats have very similar lungs to us. Now, human anatomy began later in Greece with Herophilus and Erostratus. In Alexandria, a law was passed allowing them to work on criminals. So a criminal, after execution, could possibly be worked on by one of these philosophers. And I want to fast forward a little bit to the Roman Empire with the scientist Galen. Galen also used a system based upon animal anatomy, but he made it under the assumption that animal anatomy and human anatomy was the same. So it wasn't completely accurate. And the problem was that over the next 1400 years, Galen's knowledge was essentially unchallenged. Because after the Roman Empire collapsed, there was kind of like it entered the Dark Ages, where there was sort of like a stop in knowledge and development of sciences and other subjects. And we want to fast forward once again to about the 1600s or so in England. Now, in England during this time, cadavers were banned until the 16th century. So it was pretty much impossible for medical school to get their hands upon a cadaver. Later, they were given some limited supply. A med school could expect maybe 1 cadaver a year. But the problem with that is you would have 1 cadaver, 300 medical students, so there simply wasn't enough of a supply. But there was demand. And what you saw during this time is a sort of black market for cadavers. What would happen, there would be people called body snatchers. And what they would do, they would essentially rob graves and sell the corpses off to the medical schools. And this is kind of like how the schools would get their supply of cadavers for the year. And they generally needed a fresh cadaver, like someone recently buried, because over time, after a person dies, the body will decompose, and the quality of the structures of the organs will deteriorate. That's why you need a fresh one. And later on, in 1751, an act was passed in England that expanded upon cadaver supply to kind of combat the black market during this time. And like in Alexandria with the Greeks, now you see anatomists who are enabled to work on cadavers of criminals. So after execution, a criminal could be dissected upon by a scientist. And then much later on, about a century later in 1832, the Anatomy Act greatly expanded upon cadavers and the research. It was much more open to work on during this time period. And that was the landmark act for cadavers during this time. It was in place until about 1985 when it was replaced by another act. And the reason why it was so difficult to acquire cadavers during this time period is because it was sort of like a taboo. It was a very puritanical time, so like working with the blood, working with the dead, it was sort of like a sinful activity, so to speak. And now after that, we're going to fast forward again to the modern age, and we're going to see how cadavers are used in the most common application in medicine. Now I have a graph over here, I have a chart over here showing you the uses of cadavers. This big yellow area, that represents anatomical dissections. That represents about 80% of how cadavers are used. So 80% of all cadavers are used just for anatomical dissections. Now this other area, we're not going to ignore that. We're going to be covering that much later on in the speech. So don't forget about this 20% over here. And I can tell you from personal experience, over the summer I went to a university program at Georgetown, where I went into an anatomy lab and I got to work with cadavers with first-hand experience. And I can tell you that learning from a cadaver, learning anatomy that way, is an incredibly valuable experience. When my friends were in the dorms or something studying for an exam, we wish we had a cadaver to work on, because it's so much more useful when you have the actual body in your hands and you can see how it all connects. And what you see in the anatomy lab is a unique relationship between the student and the cadaver. And from my experience, we actually named our cadaver. The girls at our table named our cadaver Alejandro, another table named theirs Magnolia, and another table named theirs Priscilla. And the thing is, like, there's almost a relationship between the person and the cadaver. You treat them like as if they're a living person. Like when we had to flip a cadaver over to study the other side, the back, like the girls would like pat down like, "Oh, Alejandro, are you okay?" And that's a relationship that you really don't see about. And universities, they foster this relationship. They will hold funerals at the end of the school year, where the cadaver's family and students, and they will like come and talk about the relationship. It's kind of really an interesting thing that you don't actually hear about that often. And what you're starting to see now, especially in medical schools, using cadavers used in more like a healthcare-oriented approach. The important thing about having a cadaver is that you can know how the body responds, how it may respond to like a certain medical procedure or a surgical cut. And that's important for, as a physician and for surgical procedures to have that knowledge. And now we see the unique relationship in medicine. But what about that 20% over there? That other uses? Well, I'm going to explore that in this next point. A thing that is valuable, what is important for in a lot of fields to know, is how the body will react under a certain situation. That's important knowledge. Such as in the automobile industry, when an automobile